Good morning. Howard Glazer, Director of State Operations for New York. This morning the Governor is going to be focusing on a series of actions and updates involving the fuel supply in New York and also related to housing issues. We're joined this morning by Rear Admiral Daniel Abel. He's the commander of the 1st Coast Guard District. His district covers the border from Canada down to New Jersey. He's in charge of the Coast Guard, the ports and the harbors, all the way down the coast. We're also joined by Darrell Towns, the Commissioner of New York State Homes and Community Renewal. You'll hear from the Governor, and then Admiral Abel.
Thank you very much. Good morning. The sun is shining. We've been working our way through the situation. We're making more and more progress every day, and you can actually feel it on the streets. We're not there yet, but we've made great progress in a short period of time. Several updates for you before we get to the situation that the Admiral will speak about. In terms of power, overall, about half the homes that have been affected, about half of the homes have had their power restored. We started with about 2 million homes that had a loss of power. We're down to about 1 million homes. So that's good news for the homes who have had their power restored. Obviously, still half of the homes without power. The Long Island Power Authority, LIPA, which had at one time about 90% of their customer base was out of power, that's down to about half also, those number of homes on Long Island. So that's good progress also. We spoke with Kevin Burke in Con Ed this morning. He's been making good progress, especially in downtown Manhattan. He believes the power is going to be back on in what's called the Joralemon Tunnel, which will facilitate the MTA bringing power back to the subway system in that area. There is an additional 200 crews, that line crews that will be coming down from Quebec today, which will help the utility companies with the line restoration. Con Ed, Mr. Burke, also believes he may be in a position to turn the power back on in downtown Manhattan today, which would obviously be good news. Now, that does not mean that every light would work in downtown Manhattan. He could repower downtown Manhattan, but then there's a second question of the local networks, the building equipment that has to be checked also. But if downtown Manhattan was repowered, that would be a big step forward for the train system as well as for Con Ed and the lights. As we've spoken all along, this was always an interconnection among three elements: the water in the tunnel, getting the water out of the tunnel so we could get the electricity back on with Con Ed, so we could get the trains running again with MTA. But that would be very good news, again, especially for downtown Manhattan. My position with the utilities, which I stated yesterday, which I would like to reiterate today, I understand the utilities are working very hard. I understand that. I understand the workers at the utilities are working very hard. I also understand that I represent the people of the state of New York. I represent the people who are right now without power. I represent the people who pay the bills to the utility companies. And my position is very simple. I want accountability and I want performance. People pay their bills. The people pay their bills so they have power. They're now without power. We understand the situation, but we expect these utilities to perform adequately in this situation, and I will hold them accountable for their performance. They are businessmen, and I don't see why they would object to be held accountable for their performance, which is the general rule. In terms of home ownership, we are working on stabilizing the situation in communities in the affected region. There are still a number of communities that need more work to stabilize. Places like Long Beach, like Lindenhurst, like Staten Island, pockets in the Bronx and Queens. So we're still working on stabilizing neighborhoods. We are also beginning to transition to the reconstruction phase, especially reconstruction of home ownership. There will be many, many, many homes which were damaged to one extent or another. Some totally demolished, Some in the case of Breezy Point tragically burned down. Some flooded, so a full range of damage. And there will be a number of resources that will be available to homeowners. The first, private insurance, to the extent they had it. Secondly, the federal government through FEMA and the FEMA funds. And third, state funds and state programs that are available. We had a conversation with the president last night. Once again, he was asking how he could help, how the federal government could help. And what came out of that conversation is that we will be deploying 30 joint teams in the region between the state and the federal government through FEMA. And these joint teams will have an expert in each area, an expert who knows private insurance, an expert from FEMA who knows the FEMA funds, and an expert from the state who knows the state housing programs, thanks to Commissioner Darrell Towns, who's with us today. These joint teams will be deployed in the 30 key areas in the region, and FEMA will be providing the 30 personnel for those teams. So we thank the President for that. Once again, it's just another step in a full agenda of federal assistance to our region, and we thank him for that, and also Administrator Fugate from FEMA. But those 30 teams will start to be assembled next week, and they will be dispatched to the affected communities. They'll be in accessible locations. Homeowners can come to them, say, this is my situation, this is my home, this is the damage, this is the insurance I have, this is what I need, and these experts will actually help them put together whatever plan they need, whatever paperwork, whatever bureaucracy has to be overcome, circumvented. These teams will be on place to do that. As part of that effort, the federal funding is in place, private insurance is in place, and we want to make sure the state is doing everything that it can do. And as of today, I'm announcing that the state of New York will pledge $100 million into a fund that is dedicated to victims of Sandy and home repairs for homes that were damaged as a result of Sandy. I've spoken to the legislative leaders, Senator Dean Skelos and Assemblyman Sheldon Silver, and they concur in the allocation of $100 million in state funds to this purpose. So the teams will be going out next week. FEMA funds are in place. We'll now have $100 million in state funds, so we can begin this reconstruction and repair effort right away. If down the road the $100 million is not satisfactory, it's not enough money, then we'll reconsider that program, and I'm sure we would renew and replenish that program. But that will get us up and running and begin the reconstruction forthwith. We had also requested from the President a disaster declaration for Westchester and Rockland counties, and this morning that disaster declaration was granted. That will be assistance for Westchester and Rockland, which heretofore had not been declared a disaster area by the President. Last and importantly, the issue of gasoline. The issue of gasoline has created concern and anxiety and practical problems all throughout the region. People can't get gas. It's slowed down the delivery of services. It's increased the stress level all across the region. There'll be some specific actions that I'll announce in a moment, but I want to make sure that people understand what actually happened in this situation. One of the consequences of the storm was that there was debris in New York Harbor. We believe that containers were blown off ships. There were containers floating in the port. There were containers that were in the bottom of the port. There were containers that were submerged below the surface, so they weren't immediately visible, but they could have posed a real threat and danger to navigation. The decision was made to close the port for a period of time until the Coast Guard was confident that vessels could proceed without being in a dangerous position. This created a backlog of vessels who were trying to get into the harbor but couldn't get into the harbor until it was cleared. I spoke with the Coast Guard yesterday, and the Coast Guard, which had worked very rapidly and deployed significant resources, determined yesterday that the harbor was open for passage, or at least part of the harbor was open for passage, so the tankers could then proceed in. There's still certain navigational obstacles that might be in the harbor that the Coast Guard is attending to, but the basic point was the tankers could make progress once again. So beginning yesterday, the tankers started to re-enter the harbor. Many of these tankers and barges contain the fuel that was en route to the terminals, which would then lead to distribution centers. So to the extent there is a shortage of fuel, that's because there is a shortage of fuel. The tankers couldn't get into the harbor. The tankers are now proceeding into the harbor, and they're making great progress. One of the large distribution points is in the town of Newburgh, up the Hudson. A barge carrying 2 million gallons got to Newburgh at 2 o'clock in the morning. And there's various stories like that, where millions of gallons of gasoline are now through the harbor and going into the distribution network. There were also a number of terminals that were damaged by the storm, or power outages where terminals couldn't operate. Generators have been brought in, and many terminals are now also online. There's something called the Buckeye Pipeline, which is very important for Long Island. That was inoperable. That has now been brought online. The Port Jefferson Terminal, which is also a major distribution point, that was offline. That has been brought online. The state and the federal government are going to be taking actions to further accelerate this situation. I have just signed an executive order that waives the state's requirements that fuel tankers register and pay a tax before unloading. One of the laws in the state is fuel tankers have to register in the harbor with the state, and the state imposes a tax. We're going to waive the registration. We're going to waive the tax. I don't like to waive the tax. I don't want to lose the money, but we do want to accelerate the flow of the gasoline, and that's more important in this case. So I'll sign an executive order that does that. The federal government, I spoke to Secretary Napolitano this morning, and she is considering waiving the Jones Act, which would bring additional tankers into the New York harbor and into this region, so we'd have an additional supply of tankers with fuel. And the Secretary was considering that, but she said she would consider it on an expedited basis. So we understand why there was a shortage. The harbor is now open. There should be a real change in condition, and people should see it quickly. But at this point, let me turn it over to Admiral Abel for a more specific update on the situation. Admiral, and thank you very much for being with us, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you, Governor. Certainly, getting the port started again is an all-hands evolution, 7x24 by the Coast Guard and our partners. It's a complex system. Pre-storm, this port had about $136 million of economic impact a day. So obviously it's a huge system, very complex. Yesterday, as the Governor mentioned, we opened the port with restrictions, and mostly because of problems with the shoreside facilities, the traffic was through, not to the port. Some barges did make it up to Newburgh, and they started offloading. We also had barges that made it out to Long Island Sound to commence operations out there. Today we're turning the tide, so I think we're getting more to the port instead of through the port. Currently, as I speak, we have 2 million barrels being offloaded in the port. Some of that are barges that are offloading to the few facilities that are open. Others are tankers that are lightering, which allows the deep draft vessels that are anchored to go to a barge, and then the barge will take it to a facility that will accept it. We're looking at creative alternatives. One option is basically a barge comes in and they hose the fuel directly from the barge to a truck. If we can do that safely, and it's something that will help the supply of fuel, we'll certainly do that. The governor mentioned the Jones Act, and by waiving the Jones Act, you greatly expand the number of ships and barges that can make port here and help deliver. I just received word before we got here that Secretary Napolitano has approved the waiver to the Jones Act, and that will increase the number of vessels eligible to come here. Through all these steps we've taken, which were prudent, necessary to safely open your port, there's no question, Governor, the supply of fuel is going to increase in New York Harbor. We are working response issues. We have 3 fairly major spills on the west side of Staten Island, and we have 150 Coast Guard men and women from our strike team because we have to clean up those facilities and spill before we can get them back online. Relationships could not be better. We understand what the requirements are. We're working well with local, state, and federal partners, and things could not be better as far as working as quickly as we can. I can assure you that your Coast Guard continues to stay on the watch and will be here with the citizens of New York, sir.
Thank you very much, Admiral. And I think in closing, on this fuel situation, there is no reason to panic. There is no reason for anxiety. We understand why there was a shortage for very definable reasons. We also understand why it's going to be better, and it's going to be better in the near future. So no panic, no anxiety. We ask for a little patience once again, like so many of these situations, like restoring the power, like restoring the trains. It's going to require some patience. It's not going to get better overnight because this was a major, major assault by Mother Nature that we went through. And it's not going to be a 1 or 2 or 3 day situation. But with the gasoline, it should get better. It should get better quickly. And in all these situations, a little patience, a little compassion, a little understanding will make it better for everyone. Questions? Zach?
Governor, you mentioned accountability to the utility. Finally, some specific that I'd like to ask you about. What do you mean by that exactly? Would you like to see hearings? Would you like to see someone potentially do a job over this? I mean, what are we talking about?
Zach, I want the utilities to understand that this is a crisis for the people of this region. And it's not just a power outage, it's a power outage in the aftermath of a storm, when people can't get food, when there's damage to their homes, when they're having trouble getting gasoline. So this is a compounding situation. It's a crisis, and I want them to respond accordingly. They are businesses, and they are businesses that get paid by the consumer for a service. And basically, Zach, I want the service delivered. People pay for power. I want the people to have the power that they pay for, right? They pay their bills. They should get what they paid for. Some of the utilities have suggested that my admonition was strict for them. It wasn't. I just want them to be held accountable. We understand the situation, and New Yorkers are understanding. And we understand the tree limb falls, it hits the wire, and the wire is then broken. But we want them to do their job, and I will hold them accountable for their job. They are regulated entities. Utilities don't do this as a charitable exercise, right? They get paid to provide a service. They're regulated by the state. They're basically given their franchise by the state. And if you want the franchise from the state, if you want the permission to provide this service from the state, then I want to make sure we're dealing with companies that are good and competent and perform. Because that's my job as governor of the state of New York, representing the people of the state of New York. And I'm going to hold these utilities accountable. And I do believe in the past they haven't been held accountable. They weren't established in the Old Testament. They're there because the state of New York grants them the right to be there. And if they want to continue to be there, they're going to have to perform. And I am going to hold them accountable. We knew this storm was coming. We went through this with Hurricane Irene. So there was no great shock. I assume they're professionals and they were prepared. So yes, we'll be understanding, but we want them to be held accountable. Now, Con Ed today says they may have power back in downtown Manhattan. Great. I hope that's right. That'll be great for downtown Manhattan. I grew up in a place called Queens, and there's a place called Brooklyn, and there's a place called the Bronx, and a place called Staten Island, and they need their power back on, and a place called Westchester, and there's Nassau and Suffolk for LIPA. So I'm going to hold these public utilities accountable every day, and I'm going to remind them every day, Zach, maybe twice a day, as a matter of fact, now that I think about it.
Governor, there's a debate about the New York Marathon. It's scheduled to go on as planned for Sunday. Mayor Bloomberg wants to go ahead with the marathon. Obviously, some people disagree with that, given, as you mentioned, some of the hardship here. Can you comment on that? What do you think the New York Marathon should go on as scheduled, given all the calamity that New York is recovering from?
You know, Carl, what I said on the marathon is I think that's a decision best left to the local officials. I understand there's a difference of opinion among the local officials, and there's a debate, and I understand both sides. But I think that's an issue that they can figure out on their own.
So just a clarification on the harbor. Is it fully open now? I know that it was open with restrictions, but are all ships that are coming through getting through?
Let me ask Admiral Abel to respond to that.
It is still open with restrictions. Certain size vessels need to contact the Coast Guard. Quite frankly, the damage to the shore side is our concern. What we don't want to do is you open the harbor, you get clogged with ships that are frustrated because they can't get pier side, and then you've got a problem. So once they clear Ambrose, we need to know where they're going. Is the shoreside facility ready to accept them? And are we not going to end up with basically a traffic jam in the harbor? And so it's open with restrictions, and every day we're seeing, less red, more amber, and more green as you do the stoplight chart on every single facility in the harbor. So we're getting there.
And Governor, I know we haven't been thinking much about the election. There is some issue with electronic voting, et cetera. Have there been any conversations about this, about getting this moved up and running?
It's an issue that we're looking at, Zach. You can't really make a determination until you know where you are at that time. And we have a few days between now and then. And every day is a new day here. Where a lot of pieces are interconnected. So let's see where we are in a couple of days, and then we'll make the decision. I think if the utility companies do what they need to do and they really step up and the power is on, obviously that's going to alleviate the majority of the problem. I am excited about the President's offer on the 30 joint FEMA state teams. That's going to make a big difference because we can deploy them. I want to thank my colleagues in the legislature for agreeing on this impromptu basis for the $100 million in state funding. The legislature is not in session, as you know. To call the legislature back into session would obviously take time, so this was a creative solution to get real state funding, to get these repairs up and running. If you are in a house and you have flood damage to your home, you want it fixed now. It's actually smarter and less expensive to fix it faster before there's any mold problem or mildew problem, etc. So these teams will be out there. There'll be funding available starting on Monday, and I think that's going to make a big difference. And as I said, look, it's been a long week. It has been a long week for everyone. It's not over. There are still inconveniences, but it could have been a lot worse. And let's not minimize what we went through. Sometimes we can have a short memory. And the storm was Monday, and this is Friday. Everything should be back to normal. After the storm we went through on Monday, everything shouldn't be back to normal by Friday. It's going to take time, but we're going to get there. Carl?
Governor, do you expect any other transit service to be restored at some point today or later today?
Yes. If Con Ed is correct and they repower downtown Manhattan, and if the Joralemon Tunnel is correct, you'll see more trains coming online, and we'll have that announcement later today as we find out exactly the effect of the repowering.
Do you expect some of that to be some
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Admiral and Commissioner, for being with us today. Thank you.